The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Cecily Hargrove was elbow-deep in a man's chest cavity when the orderly placed it on the steel tray beside the surgical clamps. She did not look at it. She could not. The soldier beneath her hands was 19 years old, and the shrapnel had torn through his left lung in a way that reminded her of wet paper being ripped apart by careless fingers. She worked for 11 more minutes before the field surgeon called time of death. And even then she finished closing the wound because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Only after she had washed the blood from her hands in the basin outside the operating tent did she pick up the envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her brother Aldous had always written in that particular slant, each letter leaning forward as though the words themselves were in a hurry to arrive somewhere important. The postmark was 3 weeks old. That was normal. Nothing moved quickly in this war except the dying. She opened it standing in the mud outside the hospital tent at the American field station near Compiègne, with the sound of artillery rumbling somewhere to the northeast, like distant summer thunder that never quite became a storm. Dear Cecily, the letter began. You would not believe what they have taught us. The bayonet, sister. The bayonet is the soul of the infantry. That is what Captain Ashford tells us every morning before breakfast. And I confess that I have come to believe him. The French have a model with a blade 20 inches long, shaped like a cross, so that it punches through heavy winter coats. When you fix it to the rifle, the whole weapon stretches nearly 6 feet. The Germans call it the French needle. Can you imagine a needle 6 feet long? There is something almost elegant about it. Cecily folded the letter and pressed it against her sternum. She could feel her own heartbeat through the paper. Her brother was 26 years old. He had been a lecturer in military history at a small college in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the buildings were made of fieldstone and the professors wore tweed even in August. When the United States declared war in April of 1917, Aldous had been among the first to volunteer. He told Cecily it was his moral obligation. He told her that he understood warfare better than most because he had studied it his entire adult life. She had watched him board the train at Broad Street Station in Philadelphia, with his uniform still creased from the tailor and his boots so new they squeaked when he walked. He had waved from the window with that particular grin of his, the one that made him look 12 years old again. And she had waved back and smiled, and waited until the train was completely out of sight before she allowed herself to sit down on the platform bench and press her knuckles into her eyes. That had been 5 months ago. Now she was here too. She had volunteered 3 weeks after he shipped out, joining the Army Nurse Corps, because it was the only way a woman could get anywhere near the war. She told herself she came to help. That was partially true. She also came because the idea of sitting in Doylestown reading his letters while men bled to death an ocean away was something she could not tolerate. The hospital at Compiègne processed between 40 and 90 casualties per day, depending on which section of the line was active. Cecily had learned things about the human body that no anatomy textbook had ever prepared her for. She learned that a man's intestines, when exposed to open air, steamed in cold weather. She learned that soldiers sometimes apologized for screaming. She learned that the ones who went quiet were usually the ones you were about to lose. And through it all, Aldous kept writing. His letters were long and detailed and full of the kind of enthusiasm that made her chest ache. He described the training with the reverence of a scholar who had finally been allowed to touch the artifacts he had spent years studying behind glass. They are teaching us the lunge and the thrust and the parry, he wrote in one letter. The target areas are the throat, the breast, and the groin. The French train in what they call elbow-to-elbow formation for maximum shock when they charge. It sounds medieval, I know, but there is a logic to it that I find genuinely compelling. Captain Ashford says that an army's will to conquer can overcome any disadvantage on the battlefield. I believe he may be right. In another letter, he described the sawback bayonet. The Germans issue these to their engineering units. 29 double teeth along the spine designed for cutting brushwood and wire. But the Allied press has turned them into proof of Germanic barbarism. The truth is, they are counterproductive in actual combat. They get caught in clothing. German soldiers are so terrified of being captured carrying one that most have been recalled and had their teeth ground off. It is propaganda, Cecily. This is what happens when men who have never held a weapon write about weapons. She saved every letter. She kept them in a tin box beneath her cot arranged by date. Reading them was the only part of her day that did not smell like carbolic acid and gangrene. But something shifted in the later letters. The enthusiasm did not disappear exactly. It dimmed. The sentences grew shorter. The observations became less scholarly and more raw. Captain Ashford still believes in the frontal assault he wrote in October. He says the artillery will destroy the wire collapse, the trenches kill the defenders and knock out their machine guns. Then we will simply walk across and occupy what remains. He says this with absolute conviction. The men believe him because they need to believe someone. And then in what would turn out to be the second to last letter. The French lost 27,000 men in a single day back in 1914. August 22nd, they advanced in bright red trousers and blue coats with bands playing and flags flying. Officers leading from the front with drawn swords, walking straight into machine guns. 27,000 Cecily in one day. That was more than any single day in the entire history of French warfare. I stood on the ground where it happened. The earth is still torn up. You can still find brass buttons in the dirt if you know where to look. I picked one up and put it in my pocket, and I have been carrying it ever since, and I'm not entirely sure why. She read that letter 4 times. Then the last letter came, except it did not come by post. It came in a canvas bag with his personal effects. The bag arrived on a grey morning in late November, carried by a corporal who could not meet her eyes. Inside she found a pocket watch with a cracked crystal, a leather wallet containing a photograph of their parents, standing outside the house in Doylestown, $7 in military scrip, and one unsealed envelope. The letter inside was unfinished. The handwriting was different from all the others. The forward slant was gone. The letters stood upright and rigid as though they were bracing themselves. Dear Cecily, everything they taught us is wrong. The artillery bombardment lasted 6 days. 6 days. We were told it would destroy everything. We were told the Germans would all be dead. We were told not to run but to walk because there would be nothing left to run from. The Germans had built dugouts 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete. They simply waited until the bombardment stopped, and then they came back up to their guns, and The letter ended there. The corporal told her what he could. Aldous' unit had gone over the top at dawn. Captain Ashford had ordered the advance precisely according to doctrine. The men walked. They did not run because they had been told running was unnecessary. The German machine guns opened fire at 400 yards. The unit lost 60% of its strength in approximately 20 minutes. Aldous was found in a shell crater 30 yards from the German wire. The field medic who reached him estimated he had been alive for several hours after being hit, long enough to start writing. Cecily listened to all of this, standing perfectly still with her hands at her sides. When the corporal finished, she thanked him and asked if Captain Ashford had survived. The corporal said yes. Ashford had been wounded and evacuated to a rear hospital, but was expected to recover fully. She thanked the corporal again. She went back to her cot. She sat down and placed the unfinished letter on top of the tin box containing all the others. And then something inside her shifted. It was not grief. She had been grieving since the moment she saw the canvas bag. It was not rage, though. Rage was certainly present, circling the edges of her thoughts like a dog on a chain. It was something colder and more precise than either of those things. It was clarity. She had spent months in this hospital watching men arrive broken and trying to put them back together with sutures and bandages and morphine. She had watched boys who should have been in college classrooms die on operating tables, while field surgeons shook their heads. And she had done this work faithfully and competently, and it had not changed anything at all. The broken men kept coming. The operating tables were never empty. She was mopping up a flood while the pipe was still burst. She did not want to mop anymore. Over the following 2 weeks, Cecily Hargrove made a series of decisions that were methodical and deliberate and completely irreversible. She cut her hair with surgical scissors in the latrine at 3 in the morning. She studied herself in the spotted mirror and was satisfied that the resemblance to Aldous was strong enough. They had always shared the same narrow face, the same sharp jaw, the same grey eyes that people in Doylestown used to call the Hargrove eyes. She acquired his identification papers. This was easier than it should have been. The administrative chaos of the American Expeditionary Forces in late 1917 was staggering. Units were being formed, dissolved and reformed constantly. Records were incomplete. Transfers were processed by clerks who were themselves exhausted and overwhelmed. She presented herself at the replacement depot at Saint-Nazaire as Private Aldous Hargrove, returning from hospital recovery to rejoin his unit. The sergeant at the desk barely looked up. He stamped the papers, pointed toward a row of tents, and told her to report for transport the following morning. That night, she lay on a cot in a tent full of snoring men and stared at the canvas ceiling, and understood with perfect clarity that if she was discovered, she would be court-martialed and imprisoned, and her family would be disgraced, and none of that mattered. She arrived at the front in early January 1918. The trenches were nothing like what she had imagined from Aldous's letters. The letters had made them sound almost architectural. In reality, they were ditches, 7 feet deep, 6 feet wide, with 2 or 3 feet of sandbags stacked on top. The walls oozed groundwater. The floor was a soup of mud and duckboards that shifted underfoot. The air smelled of wet earth and unwashed men, and something sweeter underneath that she would later learn was the smell of bodies decomposing in the walls where they had been buried by shell fire and never recovered. The trench system stretched in both directions as far as she could see, zigzag patterns every few yards. She knew from Aldous's letters that this was deliberate. A straight trench would channel a shell blast down its entire length. The zigzags contained each explosion to a single bay. But what the letters had never conveyed was the claustrophobia. Because of those zigzags, you could never see more than 30 feet in any direction. The world shrank to a narrow corridor of mud and timber and sky. Everything beyond that corridor was trying to kill you, and you could not see it coming. She was assigned to what remained of Aldous's former company. Most of the men he had served with were dead or transferred. The few who remained did not recognize her because they had never met Aldous in person. He had been a replacement himself, arriving only weeks before the attack that killed him. But one man did recognize her. Rowan Phelan was 22 years old, an Irish coal miner from Pittsburgh who had enlisted because the army paid better than the Allegheny mines. And was he reasoned? Probably not much more dangerous. He was wrong about that, but by the time he figured it out, it was too late to do anything about it. Rowan had been in the same shell crater as Aldous. He was there when Aldous started writing that last letter. He was there when Aldous stopped. So when a soldier who looked remarkably like Aldous Hargrove appeared in the trench one January morning, Rowan Phelan looked at her for a very long time. He looked at the way she held the rifle, which was slightly wrong. He looked at the way she stood, which was slightly different. He looked at her hands, which were too precise in their movements, too careful, too practiced at delicate work. He waited until they were alone in a section of communication trench, and then he said very quietly, "You are his sister." It was not a question. Cecily did not deny it. There was no point. Instead, she looked at him and said, "Are you going to report me?" Rowan Phelan thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. "Your brother saved my life," he said. "He threw himself over me when the shells started falling. That is why I am standing here, and he is not. I owe him everything." He paused. "I will not report you. But you should know that what you are doing is either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the most foolish, and I genuinely cannot tell which." From that moment, Rowan became her shadow. He taught her the things that Aldous's letters had never mentioned. How to sleep, standing up in a fire bay. How to keep your rifle dry by wrapping the bolt in an oiled rag. How to eat cold rations without gagging. How to time your movements in the trench so you never stood above the sandbag line for more than 1 second. And he taught her the most important lesson of all. The lesson that the entire Western Front had learned through 4 years and millions of dead. Everything the generals believed about this war was catastrophically wrong. The 440 miles of trenches that stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border were proof of a single devastating fact. A revolution in firepower had not been matched by any advance in tactics. The defenders held every advantage. There were no flanks to turn. Every attack had to go straight into prepared positions, and every attack failed. Over 4 million men had been killed or wounded in just the first 5 months of the war, and the lines had barely moved. Cecily stood in that trench on her first night and looked out through a periscope across no man's land. The terrain was a wasteland of mud and craters and shattered tree stumps and tangles of rusting wire. She could see shapes in the darkness that might have been bodies or might have been debris, and in this landscape there was no meaningful difference between the two. And she understood in that moment exactly what Aldous had been trying to tell her in that last unfinished letter. Everything they taught us is wrong. The artillery did not destroy the wire. The bombardments did not kill the defenders. The machine guns could not be silenced by willpower or courage or any amount of sheer determination. The entire philosophy of offensive warfare that men like Ashford had preached with religious conviction had crashed into the reality of industrial killing and been ground to dust. The question was no longer how to win. The question was how to survive. And somewhere in the darkness on the other side of that ruined landscape in trenches that were deeper and better built and reinforced with concrete and timber, the Germans were asking themselves the very same question. And they were about to come up with an answer that would change everything. But Cecily Hargrove did not know that yet. All she knew, standing in the mud with her dead brother's name pinned to her chest, and the sound of distant guns rolling across the flatlands like the heartbeat of something enormous and dying, was that she had come here to understand why men like Aldous were being fed into this machine. She was about to find out, and the answer would be worse than anything she had imagined. The transfer came 3 weeks after she arrived at the front. Not by request. Nobody requested anything in the trenches. Things happened to you or they did not, and the machinery that decided which was which operated far above the mud and the wire in offices, where men with clean uniforms moved pins on maps and called it strategy. A runner appeared in the communication trench one morning and told Cecily and Rowan and 9 other men to collect their kit and report to a farm building half a mile behind the lines. No explanation was given. None was expected. They walked through the communication trenches in single file heads below the parapet and emerged into the rear area where the world suddenly had colors again, and you could stand upright without the fear of a sniper's bullet rearranging the contents of your skull. The farm building had once been a dairy. The cows were long gone. The stone walls were pockmarked with shrapnel scars and one corner of the roof had collapsed. But the main structure was solid enough. Inside, the stalls had been cleared and replaced with wooden benches and a table covered with objects that looked like they belonged in a medieval armory. The man standing behind the table was Lieutenant Callum Firth. He was 28 years old, Canadian, with the particular complexion of someone who had spent too many nights in the open air and not enough days in sunlight. His face was all angles and shadows. His hands were covered in small scars that overlapped each other so densely they formed a kind of topography. He stood very still when he spoke the way men stand who have learned that unnecessary movement draws fire. He did not introduce himself with rank or unit. He said, "You have been selected for raiding duty. Everything you have learned about fighting this war is now useless to you. We are going to start over." Then he picked up the first object from the table. It was a club, a length of hardwood about 18 inches long, with a heavy head fashioned from the empty metal casing of a Mills bomb. Hobnails had been driven into the head in a ring pattern so that every surface that could make contact with a human body would tear as well as crush. "This," Firth said, "is your new best friend." He set it down and picked up another. This one had a flexible coil attached to the striking head, which gave it a whipping motion on impact. It looked like something from the 13th century because that was essentially what it was. The men on the benches stared. Some of them laughed nervously. One of them, a farm boy from Ohio, whose name Cecily would learn, was Hobson, raised his hand and asked what had happened to the rifles. Firth looked at him for a long moment. Have you ever tried to swing a 6-foot rifle with a bayonet attached inside a trench that is 6 feet wide with a ceiling of sandbags and a zigzag corner every 10 yards, he said. It was not a question. You cannot. The weapon that armies spent decades perfecting for this war is completely useless in the one place where this war is actually fought. The bayonet gets stuck in bodies. It gets stuck in wood. It gets stuck in heavy winter coats. There are dead men out there in no man's land who were found still pinned together by each other's bayonets. Both of them dead, neither one able to pull free. He let that image settle. So we go back, he said. We go back 500 years, clubs, knives, sharpened shovels. He held up the shovel. It was a standard entrenching tool, the kind every soldier carried, except the edges had been ground to a razor sharpness that caught the light coming through the broken roof. This is the most effective close-quarters weapon in this war, Firth said. Better than the club because of the weight distribution. Better than the knife because of the reach. And unlike the bayonet, it does not get stuck. You hit a man with this and you pull it back and you hit the next man. Simple, fast, final. He set the shovel down and picked up a knife. It was the American Mark I trench knife, and it was unlike any knife Cecily had ever seen. The handle incorporated brass knuckles with pointed studs, so the grip itself was a weapon. The base of the handle extended into a rounded protrusion that the manual referred to as a skull crusher cap. The entire knife blade and handle and all metal surfaces had been blackened so that nothing would glint in moonlight. Firth spent the next 4 hours teaching them how to kill silently. Cecily listened to every word. She memorized the techniques the way she had once memorized surgical procedures, with the same clinical precision and the same detachment from what the knowledge actually meant in practice. Firth explained the target areas for a knife attack, and Cecily realized with a cold shock that she already knew them. Not from combat training, from anatomy, the subclavian artery, the carotid, the femoral, the intercostal spaces between the ribs where a blade could reach the heart without being deflected by bone. She had spent months learning where these things were so she could save lives. Now she was learning the same map in reverse. Firth noticed. He noticed because noticing things was the reason he was still alive after 2 years of raiding. You, he said, pointing at her. Where did you learn to handle a blade like that? Cecily kept her voice low and flat the way she had trained herself to speak since arriving at the front. Butcher's apprentice, she said, back in Pennsylvania. Firth studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he moved on. The training lasted 10 days. They rehearsed in a mock trench system that had been dug behind the lines specifically for this purpose. They practiced moving in darkness, navigating by touch and sound alone. They learned to cut barbed wire silently, using heavy rubber gloves that protected against both the barbs and the noise. They learned the signals, all hand gestures, because a voice carries across no man's land like a bell in a cathedral. Firth explained the objectives of trench raiding with the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing carpentry. You are not attacking the enemy line, he said. You are not trying to capture ground. You are going in to accomplish specific tasks and then getting out before the enemy can organize a response. The tasks are these. First, capture prisoners for intelligence. Command needs to know which units are facing us, whether reinforcements are being moved, in what the enemy's morale is like. A single captured soldier can answer all of those questions. Second, destroy equipment. Machine guns, trench mortars, ammunition stores, anything that makes the enemy's position stronger. Third, kill. Every German soldier killed in a raid is one fewer soldier manning the line when the next big attack comes. He paused. You have 20 minutes from the moment you enter the enemy trench. After 20 minutes, reinforcements will arrive from neighboring sectors, and you will be overwhelmed and killed. Do not lose track of time. And then he told them about the other reason for raiding, the one that the official reports never mentioned. In many sectors, he said, the soldiers on both sides have developed informal agreements. They do not shoot to kill. They do not shell the latrines. They do not attack during meals. They have decided without orders and without permission to let each other live. He said this without judgment. Command does not approve of this arrangement. Trench raids are used to break it. When you raid the enemy trench and kill their men, they will retaliate the following night. The cycle of violence restarts. The men are forced back into active combat whether they want it or not. You are not just raiders. You are the instrument by which the war is kept alive. Nobody on the benches said anything. Firth looked at them. That is the truth of it, he said. Now let us discuss how to survive it. The first raid came on a moonless night in early February. 12 men. Cecily was among them. Firth led. They blackened their faces with burnt cork mixed with grease. They stripped off everything that could rattle or shine. Identity discs were removed. Letters, photographs, anything that could identify their unit if they were captured or killed. All of it was left behind. They carried clubs and knives and grenades and one pistol per man, because inside a trench, a pistol was worth more than any rifle ever made. They went over the top at 2 in the morning. No man's land was approximately 200 yards across at this section. 200 yards of mud and shell craters and rusting wire and darkness. Cecily went on her belly. The technique was simple in theory and agonizing in practice. You pressed yourself flat against the earth and pulled yourself forward with your elbows inches at a time, keeping your body below the profile of the terrain. The mud was cold and wet, and it soaked through every layer of clothing within the first 30 seconds. The wire was the first obstacle. 30 feet of it strung between iron stakes in rows that overlapped so densely you could not see through them. Empty tin cans hung from the lower strands. Touch one and it would rattle, and every German sentry within 100 yards would know exactly where you were. Firth had sent a wire-cutting party out 2 nights earlier. They had opened a narrow path barely wide enough for one man at a time and marked it with strips of dark cloth tied to the stakes at knee height. Cecily found the path by feel, running her gloved hands along the stakes until she touched fabric. She was halfway through the wire when the first star shell went up. The sound was a hollow thump from somewhere behind the German line, and then a hissing arc of light rising into the sky. And then the magnesium flare ignited, and the darkness vanished. No man's land was suddenly illuminated with a cold white light that turned every shadow into a razor-edged accusation. Cecily froze. Every man in the raiding party froze. She pressed her face into the mud and closed her eyes, because Firth had taught her that open eyes reflect light, and a German sentry scanning through binoculars could spot that reflection from 200 yards away. The flare burned for approximately 90 seconds. It felt like 90 years. Then the light faded and died, and the darkness returned, and Cecily started crawling again. They reached the German parapet at 2:27, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Firth signaled with his hand, and 2 men moved to the left and 2 to the right, and the rest went over the sandbags and dropped into the trench. What followed was 20 minutes that Cecily would remember for the rest of her life in the way that one remembers a fever dream in fragments that were vivid beyond reason, and connected by gaps that the conscious mind simply refused to fill. The German sentry at the nearest fire bay was asleep. Firth killed him without waking him, which was a mercy that the sentry would never know about. They moved down the trench in pairs, clearing each bay, and the zigzag pattern that was designed to contain shell blasts also contained sound, which meant that the Germans in the next section did not hear what was happening in the section before. Cecily entered the 3rd bay and found 2 German soldiers sitting on the fire step. One was eating something from a tin. The other was writing a letter by the light of a candle stub. The one with the letter looked up, and his eyes went wide. And Cecily understood that she had approximately 1 second before he shouted. She hit him with the sharpened shovel. The sound it made was not the sound she had expected. It was duller and wetter than she had imagined during training, and the resistance was less than she anticipated, because the edge was so sharp that it did not bounce off bone the way a blunt instrument would. The German fell sideways off the fire step. The one with the tin dropped it and reached for his rifle, and Rowan was there coming around the traverse, and the trench club ended it. Cecily stood in that bay with the shovel in her hand and looked at the man she had killed. He was young, perhaps 20. The letter he had been writing was soaking up blood from the duckboards. She could see the handwriting. It slanted forward the way Aldous' handwriting had slanted forward, as though the words were in a hurry to arrive somewhere important. She did not have time to think about that. There was never time to think in a trench raid. Thinking was a luxury reserved for people who were not going to die in the next 15 minutes. They captured 2 prisoners. They destroyed a machine gun emplacement by dropping grenades into the dugout beneath it. They killed 11 German soldiers in 20 minutes. And then they pulled back through the wire and across no man's land, and dropped back into their own trench with 9 minutes to spare before the German counterfire started. The raiding party lost 1 man. Hobson, the farm boy from Ohio, caught a rifle round during the withdrawal. It hit him in the throat, and he was dead before anyone could reach him. Firth counted heads in the trench and looked at Cecily. She was covered in mud and someone else's blood, and her hands were shaking so badly that she could not uncurl her fingers from the shovel handle. "You did well," he said. That was all. He moved on to check the prisoners. Cecily stood against the trench wall and pressed the back of her head against the sandbags and stared up at the sky and waited for the shaking to stop. It did not stop for a very long time. She raided 17 more times over the following 6 weeks. Each time the preparation was the same. The blackened faces, the stripped gear, the rubber gloves, the silent crossing, and each time the fighting inside the German trenches was the same particular brand of horror that no amount of repetition could make normal. But something changed in Cecily during those raids. The medical knowledge that she had brought from the hospital did not disappear when she crossed no man's land. It transformed. She knew the human body with an intimacy that none of the other raiders possessed. She knew where the arteries ran, and where the nerves clustered, and where the joints were weakest. In the operating tent, this knowledge had been the architecture of healing. In the trenches, it became the architecture of killing. The same map, the same landmarks, a completely different purpose. On the 4th raid, a German soldier came around a traverse with a bayonet leveled at her chest. He was a big man broad through the shoulders, and he lunged with the kind of desperate strength that fear gives to people who believe they are about to die. Cecily did not try to block the bayonet. She stepped inside its arc, which was the one thing the German had not expected, because every instinct tells you to move away from a blade, not toward it. She struck him once with the edge of the shovel at the precise junction of the neck and shoulder, where the subclavian artery runs just beneath the clavicle. She knew this because she had clamped that artery on an operating table 6 months earlier to save a man's life. The German dropped his rifle. He took 1 step backward. Then he sat down on the fire step with a look of profound confusion on his face, as though the war had just asked him a question he did not have the answer to, and he did not get up again. Firth was watching from the next bay. He did not say anything at the time. But later, back in their own trenches, he found Cecily sitting alone in a section of communication trench, staring at her hands. "That was not a butcher's trick," he said. Cecily did not look up. Firth sat down beside her. He was quiet for a while. The distant guns muttered to themselves on the horizon the way they always did a conversation between machines that never reached any conclusion. "I do not need to know what you are," Firth said. "I have been doing this for 2 years. I have seen men who could shoot straighter than any marksman in the British Army. I have seen men who could throw a grenade into a window from 40 yards. But I have never seen anyone who knows how to take a man apart the way you do. You know where things are inside a body. You know it the way a doctor knows it, or a surgeon, or a nurse." Cecily said nothing. Firth stood up. "Whatever you are," he said, "you are keeping my men alive. That is the only thing I care about in this war anymore." And he walked away down the trench. There was a second advantage that no one had anticipated. When a raider was hit during an action, the standard procedure was to drag him back and hope for the best. Cecily could do more than hope. She could apply a tourniquet in the dark by touch alone. She could pack a wound with field dressings in the time it took most men to figure out where the bleeding was coming from. She could tell the difference between arterial bleeding and venous bleeding by the rhythm of the flow against her fingers when she could not see the color in the darkness. On the seventh raid, a man named Prescott took a bayonet through his thigh. The blade nicked the femoral artery, and blood began pulsing from the wound in the bright red surges that meant he had minutes to live. In the operating tent at Compiègne, Cecily would have clamped the artery with a hemostat and sutured it under clean light with sterile instruments and the calm assistance of a trained surgical team. In the German trench in the dark, with gunfire and grenade blasts echoing off the walls, and the screaming of men who were being killed in the bays on either side, she used her thumb. She pressed her thumb directly into the wound and found the artery by feel and held it closed, while Rowan wrapped the leg with every field dressing they had between them. Prescott screamed. She told him to shut up because sound carried, and the Germans in the next section would hear him. He shut up. She maintained pressure for 7 minutes while the raiding party completed its withdrawal, and then she and Rowan carried Prescott between them across 200 yards of no man's land with Cecily's thumb still pressed into his leg. Prescott survived. He was evacuated to a base hospital and eventually sent home to Massachusetts, where he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he would walk, which was more than the field surgeon at the casualty clearing station had expected when they brought him in. After that, the other raiders began to treat Cecily with a kind of reverent confusion, as though she possessed some ability they could not explain and did not want to question. They did not know what she was. They did not ask. In the economy of the trenches, where the only currency that mattered was whether the person next to you could keep you alive for one more night, questions about identity were a luxury that no one could afford. Rowan understood. He said nothing. Between raids, the war continued its grinding routine. Stand to at dawn and dusk, when every man in the trench stood on the fire step with his weapon ready, because those were the hours when attacks were most likely. Sentry duty through the night, 2 hours on and 4 hours off, staring into a darkness that could kill you at any moment. Working parties to repair the trenches that shell fire had collapsed during the day. Carrying parties to bring up food and ammunition and water from the rear through communication trenches that were sometimes knee-deep in mud. And always the constant presence of death in forms that ranged from sudden and spectacular to slow and degrading. A sniper's bullet that arrived without warning and dropped a man mid-sentence. A shell that landed in a crowded bay and turned 5 human beings into something that had to be shoveled off the duckboards. Trench foot that rotted a man's flesh from his bones because his feet had been wet for 3 weeks without stopping. Rats the size of house cats that grew fat on the dead and were bold enough to run across a sleeping man's chest. Cecily endured all of this the way she had endured the hospital, with a clinical detachment that was not coldness but rather a very particular form of discipline. She filed each horror in a place inside her mind where it could be acknowledged without being felt, at least not immediately, at least not while there was work to be done. She suspected there would be a reckoning eventually. She suspected that the place where she was storing these things was not infinite. But that was a problem for after the war, if there was an after the war, and right now the only relevant question was whether she and the men around her would survive the next 24 hours. She also observed during these weeks the phenomenon that Firth had described during training, the live and let live system. In the quiet sectors between raids, there was an unspoken agreement between the two sides. The German machine gun that fired 10 rounds every hour on the hour into the same empty stretch of no man's land. The British artillery that shelled the same abandoned crossroads every afternoon at 3. The mutual understanding that latrines were off limits and that the hour around breakfast was a time of informal truce. It was, Cecily thought, the sanest thing about the entire war. 2 groups of men who had been ordered to kill each other had instead negotiated without words and without permission, a system that allowed the maximum number of them to survive. It was a conspiracy of the powerless against the powerful, a quiet rebellion of common sense against the machinery of death. And it was exactly this system that the trench raids were designed to destroy. She understood it now in a way that Firth's explanation during training had not fully conveyed. Every time her raiding party crossed no man's land and killed German soldiers in their trenches, the Germans retaliated the following night. The cycle of violence restarted. Men who had been content to aim their shots high and let the other side live were now shooting to kill because someone had killed their friends. The informal truce shattered, and it took weeks to rebuild if it rebuilt at all. She was the instrument of that destruction. She had become very good at it, and she was not sure what that said about her. On the night of March 2nd, Callum Firth led his last raid. It was a larger operation than usual. 24 men targeting a section of German trench that intelligence believed contained a battalion headquarters. The objective was to capture an officer who could provide information about German troop movements. There had been unusual activity behind the German lines for weeks, trains arriving at night, supply columns moving under darkness. Something was building over there, and command wanted to know what it was. The crossing went badly from the start. The wire-cutting party had been spotted 2 nights earlier, and the Germans had repaired the gaps and added new wire. Firth's men had to cut fresh paths under the noses of sentries who were now alert and suspicious. 2 star shells went up during the cutting, and both times the party had to freeze in positions that left them tangled in the half-cut wire with barbs digging into their clothing and their skin. They reached the German trench 40 minutes behind schedule. Firth made the decision to go in anyway. The intelligence was too valuable to abandon. The fighting inside was worse than any raid Cecily had experienced. The Germans were expecting something. The sentries were doubled. Dugout entrances had been booby-trapped with grenades rigged to tripwires. 3 raiders were killed in the first 2 minutes. They found the headquarters dugout, and Cecily went down the steps with her pistol in one hand and her blackened knife in the other. Inside, she found 3 German officers. 2 were asleep on cots. 1 was awake, sitting at a field desk covered in maps, writing by the light of an oil lamp. He was young, 26, fair-haired with sharp features and calm blue eyes that did not show fear when Cecily came through the door. He looked at her, and then at the pistol, and then back at her face with an expression that was closer to curiosity than alarm. His name was Erwin Stark. The capture took less than a minute. Cecily disarmed him while Rowan secured the other 2 officers. They gathered every document on the desk and in the map case, and then they moved for the exit. The withdrawal was chaos. The Germans had organized a response faster than expected, and the trench was full of soldiers converging from both directions. Firth organized a rearguard at a traverse junction, holding the bend with grenades and pistol fire, while the main group pulled the prisoners back toward no man's land. They made it to the wire. They made it through the gaps. And then Firth, who was the last man out, who was always the last man out because that was the kind of leader he was, became disoriented in the darkness. It happened the way it always happened. The star shells and the muzzle flashes created a strobing confusion of light and shadow that destroyed depth perception and turned familiar terrain into an alien landscape. Firth ran through the darkness and dropped into a trench with the automatic relief of a man reaching safety. It was not his trench. Cecily heard the shots from 50 yards away. Short bursts of rifle fire followed by shouting in German, and then silence. She waited in a shell crater for 20 minutes, hoping. Rowan waited with her. They both knew. They waited anyway. Callum Firth did not come back. Cecily was given command of the raiding section the following day, not because she was the most experienced, not because she was the highest ranking, because the men who had raided with her trusted her in a way they could not fully articulate, and in the world of the trenches that trust was the only currency that mattered. The German officer she had captured, Erwin Stark, was interrogated at division headquarters. Cecily was present for part of the questioning, because she had led the raid that captured him. Stark answered some questions and declined others with a politeness that seemed genuine rather than performed. He confirmed what intelligence had suspected. The Germans were massing forces on the Western Front on a scale not seen since 1914. But it was during the transfer from the interrogation room to the prisoner holding area that Stark said something Cecily would not forget. They were walking through a communication trench, Stark between two guards with Cecily behind, when he turned his head slightly and spoke in English that was accented but precise. "Your raids are effective," he said. "Small, violent, fast. But you are using a scalpel when what is needed is a battering ram. We have understood this. You will see what I mean soon enough." Cecily said nothing. Stark looked at her a moment longer. "You are different from the others," he said. "I do not know how, but you are different." Then the guards moved him forward, and the conversation ended. 1 week later, Captain Winslow Ashford returned to the front. He had been away for months recovering from the wound he received during the same attack that killed Aldous. He walked with a slight limp now, and his face had the drawn quality of a man who had been ill for a long time. But his eyes were the same, sharp and certain, and not entirely open to the possibility that he might be wrong about something. He was assigned to oversee the sector that included Cecily's raiding section. On his second day, he reviewed the raiding logs. On his third day, he requested a meeting with the section leader. Cecily stood in front of his desk in a dugout that smelled of damp timber and pipe tobacco, and understood that this was the moment everything could end. Ashford had served with Aldous. Ashford had given the order that sent Aldous over the top. He had known Aldous's face. Ashford studied her for a long time. He looked at the personnel file. He looked at her face. He looked at the file again. "Private Hargrove," he said. "Sir, you have led 9 raids in 6 weeks. You have the lowest casualty rate of any raiding section in this division. You have captured more prisoners than sections twice your size. You are, by every measure, I can find the most effective trench raider currently operating in this sector." He paused. "You are also not Aldous Hargrove." The words hung in the air of the dugout like smoke. Cecily said nothing. There was nothing to say. She stood at attention and waited for the thing that was going to happen next. Ashford leaned back in his chair. He pressed his fingertips together and looked at her over them with an expression she could not read. "I gave the order that killed your brother," he said. "I ordered those men to walk into machine gun fire because I believed with complete sincerity that the bombardment had destroyed the German defenses. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. And I have spent every day since then trying to understand how a man who dedicated his entire career to the study of warfare could have been so profoundly mistaken about its most basic reality." He lowered his hands. "I do not care who you are," he said. "I do not care what you are. I care that you are keeping soldiers alive in a war that has proven remarkably efficient at killing them. Your secret is your own. It will remain so for as long as you continue to do what you are doing." Cecily stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, "Thank you, sir." Ashford nodded. "Do not thank me," he said. "I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because I have sent enough people to die for the wrong reasons." Cecily left the dugout and walked back through the communication trench to her section. Rowan was waiting. He looked at her face and understood that something significant had happened. But he did not ask what, because Rowan Fellon had learned a long time ago in the coal mines of Pittsburgh and in the trenches of France that there were things people needed to tell you in their own time or not at all. She told him anyway. He listened. He nodded once. And then he said the thing that Rowan Fellon always said when the world revealed itself to be stranger and more terrible and occasionally more decent than he had expected. "Well then," and they went back to work. March came to the Western Front the way death came to the trenches. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Cecily felt it before she understood it. The German artillery had gone quiet for 3 days. No harassing fire. No star shells at night. No patrols probing the wire. The silence was unnatural, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made the men in the trenches speak in whispers without knowing why. Rowan noticed it too. He stood beside her in the fire bay on the evening of March 20th, chewing on an unlit cigarette because lighting one after dark would get you killed. And he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. They are not resting over there. They are holding their breath. He was right. What Cecily did not know, what no one on the Allied side fully understood until it was too late, was that the end of the war with Russia in early March had freed nearly 50 German divisions. They had been transferred west in trains that ran day and night for weeks. For the first time since 1914, Germany outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front. And the German High Command understood with absolute clarity that this advantage was temporary. American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 per day. Within months, the numbers would shift permanently against Germany. This was their last chance, their only chance. And the instrument of that chance was Erwin Stark. Cecily had not thought about him often since the night she captured him in that German trench. There had been too many other nights, too many other raids, too many other faces in the darkness. But Stark had thought about her. Or rather, he had thought about what she represented. The trench raiders were clever and brave and lethal in their small way, but they were surgical instruments, scalpels. What Stark wanted to build was a sledgehammer. He had returned to German lines through a prisoner exchange in late February. Within days, he was given command of a stormtrooper battalion. The men were volunteers, most of them under 25, selected for athleticism and aggression, and the particular kind of intelligence that allows a man to make life and death decisions in the space of a single heartbeat. They carried satchels stuffed with grenades. They carried the new MP-18 submachine gun, a weapon that fired 400 rounds per minute from a 32-round drum magazine. They carried Luger pistols fitted with extended magazines and shoulder stocks. They carried flamethrowers. They carried a lighter version of the MG-08 machine gun that could be dragged forward during an assault. And they carried trench clubs and knives and sharpened shovels. Because Stark understood what Cecily had learned months ago, that in the end, in the final terrible moments when the ammunition ran out and the grenades were spent, and the only thing between you and the enemy was 3 feet of muddy air, the war always came back to the most primitive weapons human beings had ever devised. But the weapons were not what made the stormtroopers different. The doctrine was. Every failed offensive of the past 4 years had followed the same pattern. Bombard the entire front, attack the entire front, push forward in a straight line, and fail. Stark's stormtroopers would do the opposite. They would not attack strong points. They would flow around them like water around stones. They would find the gaps, the weak spots, the places where the defenders were thin or tired, or looking the wrong way. They would pour through those gaps and keep moving, bypassing fortified positions, entirely leaving them for the follow-up waves. Their targets were not the front-line trenches. Their targets were the things behind the trenches, the artillery batteries, the command posts, the supply depots, the telephone exchanges. Cut those and the entire defensive system would collapse from within. And there was one more difference that mattered more than all the others combined. Junior officers were expected to think for themselves. No waiting for orders from headquarters. No rigid adherence to plans that became obsolete the moment the first shot was fired. Speed, initiative, judgment. The qualities that conventional military thinking had spent decades trying to train out of its officers were exactly the qualities that Stark demanded from his. Cecily would have recognized the philosophy instantly. It was what Callum Firth had taught her. It was what she had been practicing on every raid for months. The difference was scale. At 4:40 in the morning on March 21st, the German guns opened fire. 1 million shells in 5 hours. It was the largest artillery bombardment in the history of warfare. The ground shook so violently that men standing in trenches 3 miles behind the front were knocked off their feet. The sound was beyond sound. It was a physical force that compressed the air in your lungs and made your vision blur and turned rational thought into something you had to fight for like oxygen. Cecily was in a dugout when it started. The timber supports groaned and shifted overhead. Dirt rained from the ceiling in continuous streams. The candle on the shelf guttered and went out. And in the absolute darkness, she could hear men praying in voices that did not sound like voices anymore. The bombardment lasted until 9:30, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the shelling, because the silence meant They were coming. And then the fog rolled in, a thick, wet channel fog that reduced visibility to less than 20 yards. It was as though the earth itself was conspiring with the German assault. Cecily climbed out of the dugout and into the trench and could see almost nothing. Shapes in the mist, movement that might have been men, or might have been shadows, or might have been her own fear taking physical form. The first stormtroopers appeared like ghosts. They came out of the fog without warning, without the massed formations that every previous assault had used. Small groups, 5 men, 8 men, moving fast and low-flowing through the gaps in the wire that the bombardment had torn open, bypassing the strong points heading for the rear. Cecily saw them and understood immediately what was happening. This was not a trench raid. This was everything she had learned about trench raiding, applied on a scale she had never imagined. The infiltration tactics, the small unit autonomy, the speed, the violence. It was all there. But instead of 20 men hitting a single trench bay and withdrawing, it was thousands of men hitting the entire front simultaneously and not stopping. The line broke, not in one place, in dozens of places. The stormtroopers poured through like water through a cracked dam, and the defenders, who were not killed or captured in the first minutes, found themselves surrounded, cut off fighting enemies who were behind them and beside them, and sometimes above them, on the parapet of their own trenches. Cecily's section held for approximately 40 minutes. She rallied 12 men in a communication trench and organized a fighting withdrawal that Callum Firth would have recognized and approved of. She used the zigzag pattern of the trenches, the way she had used them on raids, letting the corners absorb grenades, setting ambushes at the traverses, making the stormtroopers pay for every bay they took. But there were too many of them, and they were too fast, and they kept coming. It was during the withdrawal that Rowan was hit. A grenade landed 6 feet from him in a fire bay. Cecily saw it and shouted, but there was no time. Rowan threw himself sideways, and the blast caught his left arm from the elbow down. He fell against the trench wall and slid to the floor with his eyes very wide and his mouth open, and no sound coming out, which was worse than screaming, because it meant the shock had already set in. Cecily was beside him in 3 seconds. She had a tourniquet on the arm in 15. The training she had tried so hard to hide, the precise medical knowledge that had made her such an effective raider, because she knew exactly where to strike a human body, now served its original purpose. She stopped the bleeding. She stabilized him. She saved his life in a muddy trench while German stormtroopers advanced through the fog less than 100 yards away. Rowan looked at her while she worked. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow and fast. And through the shock and the pain, he managed to say one thing: "Still cannot tell if you are brave or foolish." They retreated for 2 weeks. 60 kilometers, the deepest German advance on the Western Front since 1914. For the first time in 4 years, the war became mobile again. Trenches that had been occupied for years were abandoned in hours. Supply dumps were burned to keep them out of German hands. Roads that had been behind the lines for so long that estaminets and cinemas had been built along them were suddenly within range of German artillery. The retreat was not the orderly withdrawal described in training manuals. It was a staggering, desperate flight through a landscape that was falling apart. Cecily's group started with 12 men. By the end of the first day, it was 9. By the third day, it was 7 plus Rowan on a stretcher, improvised from 2 rifles and a greatcoat. They moved at night when they could, hiding in ruined buildings and shell craters during the day when German aircraft circled overhead like vultures waiting for something to stop moving. She lost 2 men at a crossroads on the 4th day. They had stopped to rest beside an overturned ammunition wagon when a German patrol appeared from the east, moving through a shattered orchard. The fight lasted less than a minute. Cecily killed 1 German with her pistol and another with the shovel. The patrol retreated, but 2 of her men were dead on the road, and there was nothing she could do for them except take their identification discs and leave them where they lay. She treated wounds with whatever she could find: bandages torn from shirts, water purified with iodine tablets that were running low, a bottle of brandy taken from an abandoned officer's mess that served as both antiseptic and anesthetic depending on whether she poured it on the wound or into the patient. She set a broken collarbone by feel in a root cellar, while shells burst in the field above and dirt cascaded through the floorboards onto the man's face. Rowan drifted in and out of consciousness for the first 3 days. The stump of his arm wept fluid through the bandages, and Cecily changed the dressings twice a day, with hands that did not shake because she would not allow them to shake. Not now, not while there were people depending on those hands to be steady. On the fourth day, his fever broke, and he opened his eyes and looked at her with a clarity that had been absent since the grenade. "You look terrible," he said. She almost laughed. It was the closest she had come to laughing since January. Cecily led her shrinking group through the chaos with a combination of skills that no one else on the Western Front possessed. She could fight like a raider because Callum Firth had taught her. She could think like a stormtrooper because she had studied Stark's tactics from the receiving end. And she could keep wounded men alive because, before she was a soldier, she had been a nurse, and that training ran deeper than anything the army had given her. She made decisions without waiting for orders because there were no orders to wait for. The chain of command had been shattered by the speed of the German advance. Headquarters did not know where its units were. Units did not know where their neighbors were. In that vacuum of authority, the only thing that mattered was the judgment of the person on the ground. Cecily Hargrove was that person. They reached the new Allied lines on the 14th day. A British sergeant at a hastily dug trench looked at the 5 exhausted soldiers and the man on the stretcher and asked what unit they belonged to. Cecily gave him the unit designation, and the sergeant checked a list that was already 3 pages long, with units that were missing or destroyed or had simply ceased to exist. "You are the only ones," he said. Cecily nodded. She did not have the energy to say anything else. She helped lower Rowan into the trench, and then she sat down on the fire step and closed her eyes, and did not open them for 11 hours. And then the German advance stalled. It did not stall because of Allied resistance, though that resistance was fierce and growing fiercer every day. It stalled for the same reason that every great offensive in this war had eventually stalled. The attackers outran their own logistics. The stormtroopers had advanced faster than anyone had predicted, faster than the German High Command had dared to hope. But speed was a curse disguised as a blessing. The artillery could not keep up. Supply wagons could not cross the cratered wasteland that the bombardment had created. Ammunition ran low. Food ran out. The elite soldiers who had led the assault suffered disproportionate casualties because they were always at the front, always in the heaviest fighting, and the losses could not be replaced because there was no one left who was trained to replace them. The best men died first. That was the cruel mathematics of the stormtrooper doctrine. The bravest and the most skilled and the most aggressive were the ones who pushed deepest into enemy territory, and they were the ones who died in the greatest numbers. And when they were gone, the units they left behind were hollow. The teeth had been pulled from the jaw. The Allied counterattack came in August with over 400 tanks and the largest combined force assault of the entire war. The German line buckled, then cracked, then broke. Cecily was part of the advance. And it was during this advance in a ruined village, whose name she would never learn, that she found Erwin Stark. He was in a cellar beneath a collapsed farmhouse. His stormtrooper unit had been cut off for 3 days. They had run out of ammunition on the first day. They had run out of food on the second. By the third day, they were fighting with the only weapons they had left: trench clubs, knives, sharpened shovels, the medieval weapons, the ones that both sides had turned to when everything modern failed. When Cecily came down the cellar steps with her pistol drawn and her blackened knife in her belt, she found 8 German soldiers. 6 were dead. 1 was wounded beyond saving, and 1 was sitting against the far wall with a trench club across his knees and blood on his hands that was not his own. Erwin Stark looked up at her. His uniform was torn. His face was gaunt. His eyes held the particular emptiness of a man who had seen the absolute limit of what human beings could do to each other and had passed beyond it into some territory that did not have a name. He recognized her. She could see it in the way his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. something closer to recognition of an inevitability. "The raider," he said. His voice was quiet, hoarse, the voice of a man who had not had water in a long time. Cecily did not lower her pistol. She looked at the dead men on the cellar floor, killed with clubs and shovels, and the symmetry of it hit her with a force that was almost physical. This was a man who had commanded the most advanced infantry tactics the world had ever seen. He had led soldiers equipped with submachine guns and flamethrowers and machine guns that could be carried by a single man. He had broken through defensive lines that had held for 4 years. He had pushed the war forward 60 kilometers in 2 weeks. And at the end of it, he was sitting in a cellar with a trench club across his knees. The same weapon that Callum Firth had placed on that table in the dairy barn months ago. The weapon that would have been perfectly familiar to a soldier in the 14th century. She thought about Aldous writing his last letter in a shell crater. She thought about Callum Firth jumping into the wrong trench in the darkness. She thought about Rowan Phelan lying in a fire bay, with his arm gone below the elbow. She thought about the 27,000 French soldiers in their red trousers who died in a single day, because their generals believed that willpower could stop machine gun bullets. And she thought about the letter. It was in Stark's breast pocket. She found it when she searched him. An unsealed envelope, the handwriting careful and precise, addressed to a family in Stuttgart. The paper was soft with handling, as though he had taken it out and put it back many times without finishing it. She did not read it. She did not need to. She knew what it said. She knew because it was the same letter that every soldier on every side of every war had tried to write in the moments when they understood that they were not going home. The words would be different. The language would be different. The names and addresses would be different. But the thing the letter was trying to say would be exactly the same. "I was here. I was alive. I wanted to come back to you." It was Aldous's letter. It was Firth's letter, the one he never got to write. It was every letter. Stark watched her hold the envelope. Something in his expression softened. Not quite peace, but the nearest thing to it that a man could achieve in a cellar full of the dead. "You are his sister," he said, "the one whose papers you carry. You move like him, but you are not him." Cecily looked at him. She had spent months hiding what she was. She had fooled sergeants and officers and an entire raiding section. But this man, sitting with his life bleeding out through a wound he had not even mentioned, had seen through it in the time it took to cross a cellar. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since the night you captured me," Stark said. "Your hands, the way you searched for weapons. You were checking for injuries at the same time. No soldier does that. Only someone who has been trained to heal." He closed his eyes. "It does not matter now," he said. Stark died sitting against that wall. The wound she had not noticed at first, a piece of shrapnel buried in his abdomen, had been bleeding slowly for hours. His breathing grew shallow and irregular, and then it stopped with a small exhalation that sounded almost like relief. He was dead before the stretcher-bearers arrived. Cecily placed his letter back in his pocket. She buttoned the pocket closed. It was a small gesture, and it meant nothing in any practical sense. But she did it anyway because it was the only kindness available to her in that cellar. And it seemed important not to let the last act between enemies be an act without mercy. The armistice came on November 11th at 11 in the morning. The guns stopped. The silence that followed was nothing like the silence before the spring offensive. That silence had been the silence of something coiling to strike. This silence was the silence of exhaustion so profound that even the earth seemed to sag beneath the weight of it. Men stood in the trenches and looked at each other and did not know what to do. Some cheered, some wept. Most simply stood there with the particular blankness of people who had been living inside a machine for so long that they had forgotten there was a world outside it. And now the machine had stopped and they did not know how to be human beings in the quiet. Cecily Hargrove survived. She went home to Pennsylvania in early 1919 on a transport ship that smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant, and 5,000 men who did not speak much. The crossing took 12 days. She spent most of it on deck, watching the Atlantic move beneath the hull, in long grey swells that reminded her of no man's land, seen from above an endless expanse of nothing, with something dangerous hidden just beneath the surface. She stood on the deck as the ship entered New York Harbor and watched the skyline materialize out of the morning haze and felt absolutely nothing which frightened her more than anything that had happened in France. She did not return to nursing. She did not return to Doylestown. She could not go back to the house where Aldous' books still lined the shelves in his old room, and his tweed jacket still hung on the hook behind the door, and the brass button from the battlefield near Alsace was probably still sitting on his desk, where he had left it before shipping out. She could not sit in that house and be the person she had been before. She opened a small clinic in a quiet town in Bucks County, where she treated farmers and their children, and quietly without advertising or announcement. The men who came to her door with trembling hands and empty eyes and stories they could not tell anyone else. She never turned them away. She never charged them. And she never told them that she understood what they were carrying because she was carrying it too. She never spoke about what she had done. The name Aldous Hargrove appeared on no casualty list twice. The Army's records were a shambles and no one ever checked. Cecily Hargrove simply resumed her own name and her own life as though the months she had spent in the trenches had happened to someone else or perhaps had not happened at all. Rowan Phelan opened a bar in Pittsburgh with one hand and a determination that his regular customers found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on how well they knew him. He and Cecily exchanged letters twice a year for the rest of their lives. The letters were short and practical and never mentioned the war directly, but they did not need to. The fact that the letters existed at all was enough. It meant they were still here. It meant they had made it back. Above the bar, mounted on the wall between a photograph of the Pittsburgh Pirates and a calendar from the Allegheny Coal Company, hung a sharpened entrenching shovel. No one ever asked about it. He never explained. In 1914, Europe considered itself the pinnacle of modern civilization, the most technologically advanced society the world had ever produced. It had artillery that could fire shells 20 miles, machine guns that could kill 1,000 men in an hour, aircraft, submarines, warships the size of city blocks, chemical weapons that could poison the air itself. And after 4 years and 20 million dead, it all came down to clubs and sharpened shovels. The most modern war in human history ended the way wars had always ended. Not with the triumph of technology or the vindication of grand strategy, but with human beings in the mud fighting at arm's length, with whatever they could hold in their hands. The generals never understood this. The politicians never admitted it. The history books would eventually smooth it over with chapters about strategy and logistics and the evolution of combined arms doctrine. But the people who were there knew. Cecily Hargrove knew. And on quiet evenings in her clinic in Bucks County, when the last patient had gone home and the light was fading through the windows, and the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the mantel, she would sometimes open the bottom drawer of her desk and take out a tin box containing a stack of letters written in a handwriting that leaned forward as though the words themselves were in a hurry to arrive somewhere important. She would hold the box in her hands without opening it, and she would remember that the distance between civilization and savagery was exactly the width of a sharpened shovel.